The debate surrounding the strategic pivot of the German Wehrmacht in August 1941 remains one of the most fiercely contested historiographical battlegrounds of the Second World War. Following the spectacular initial successes of Operation Barbarossa, which saw the destruction of entire Soviet armies in the border battles and the massive encirclements at Bialystok, Minsk and Smolensk, the German High Command found itself at a critical strategic crossroads. The Chief of the Army General Staff, General Franz Halder, alongside the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, and his primary armored spearhead commanders, Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, advocated vociferously for an immediate, concentrated, and uninterrupted thrust toward Moscow. This Moscow First school argued that the Soviet capital was not merely a symbolic prize, but the absolute hub of the Soviet Union's centralized administrative, political, and communication networks, the capture of which would paralyze the Soviet state and force a decisive battle with the remaining reserves of the Red Army. Conversely, Adolf Hitler, in his highly controversial Führer Directive No. 33, issued on July 23, 1941, and reinforced on August 21st, dismissed Moscow as a primary objective. Hitler insisted that the agricultural wealth of Ukraine, the industrial coal fields of the Donets Basin, and the oil of the Caucasus were far more critical to sustaining Germany's long-term war effort against a looming Anglo-American coalition. This disagreement culminated in the historical decision to temporarily halt Army Group Center's eastward advance and divert Guderian's Panzer Group II southward to cooperate with Army Group South in the massive encirclement of the Soviet southwestern front around Kiev. While this detour resulted in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers and the temporary destruction of the Red Army's southern wing, it delayed the final assault on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, until October 1941, by which time the autumn rains had begun to turn the Russian steppe into an impassable quagmire of mud. The counterfactual scenario of Operation Wotan explores the profound operational and logistical consequences of overruling Hitler's economic focus, allowing Bock's reinforced Army Group Center to launch its concentrated drive on Moscow in late August or early September 1941, bypass Kiev entirely, and test whether a single, unified thrust could have achieved a decisive victory before the onset of winter. To comprehend the material feasibility of Operation Wotan, one must subject the counterfactual to the rigid, unyielding constraints of transport geography and railway engineering. The logistical architecture of the Eastern Front was entirely dictated by the profound disparity between the dense, high-capacity European railway network and the sparse, primitive Soviet transport infrastructure. As the German armies advanced deeper into Soviet territory, their reliance on railway transportation grew exponentially, yet they faced a critical technological barrier in the form of track gauge. The standard European rail gauge measured 1,435 millimeters, whereas the Soviet railway network was constructed on a wider gauge of 1,524 millimeters. This difference demanded a massive, labor-intensive effort by specialized German railway construction troops to physically convert thousands of kilometers of broad-gauge track by pulling up one rail and shifting it inward, a process that was severely bottlenecked by the destruction of bridges, water towers, and switching yards by retreating Soviet forces. By late August 1941, the German rail conversion effort had barely reached Smolensk, leaving a massive logistical vacuum between the railheads and the advancing combat units. Furthermore, the capacity of the converted lines was catastrophically low, often limited to a single poorly ballasted track that could handle only a fraction of the daily supply trains required to feed, fuel, and rearm a reinforced army group of over 1.5 million men. To sustain a continuous high-intensity offensive toward Moscow, Army Group Center required a minimum of 30 supply trains per day, Yet historically, the Reichsbahn struggled to deliver even 12 to 15 trains to the Smolensk sector due to the severe shortage of converted rolling stock, coal and water-softening chemicals necessary to prevent the calcification of German locomotive boilers. Operation Wotan would have required the immediate concentration of all available logistical assets on the central axis, a decision that would have starved army groups north and south of essential ammunition and fuel, leaving their flanks dangerously exposed and vulnerable to localized Soviet counter-offensives. The logistical geography of the Smolensk-Moscow land bridge, characterized by a near-complete lack of metalled all-weather roads and an absolute dependence on a fragile, overextended rail line, proved that any attempt to launch a massive multi-army offensive toward the capital in late August would have run dry of fuel and ammunition long before reaching its objective, regardless of the tactical brilliance of the Panzer commanders. The second critical bottleneck that would have paralyzed Operation Wotan was the rapid, irreversible attrition of the Wehrmacht's motorized transport pool. Unlike the highly mechanized image presented by wartime propaganda, the German army of 1941 was overwhelmingly reliant on horse-drawn transport for its infantry divisions, while its mobile spearheads, the Panzer and motorized infantry divisions, depended on a highly diverse, fragile and non-standardized fleet of commercial and military trucks. To bridge the vast distances of the Russian steppe, the German General Staff relied on the Gross Transportroom, large-capacity transport columns, which were tasked with carrying supplies from the railheads directly to the front line. However, the lack of paved roads, combined with the relentless, abrasive dust of the summer and the bone-jarring ruts of the primitive tracks, inflicted a devastating toll on these vehicles. By late August 1941, the motorized divisions of Army Group Centre had already lost between 30 and 50% of their original transport capacity due to mechanical breakdowns, suspension failures, and tyre wear. The supply of spare parts was an absolute administrative nightmare, as the Wehrmacht operated over 2,000 different types of trucks. Many of them captured French, British, and Belgian vehicles that lacked any standardized component swap capability. This metallurgical and mechanical breakdown meant that even before Operation Wotan could be launched, Guderian's and Hoth's panzer groups were experiencing a severe reduction in their operational radius, with supply trucks spending more time in repair depots than on the road. To mount a single, concentrated drive on Moscow, these transport columns would have been forced to operate over distances exceeding 400 kilometers from the nearest functional railhead. At this operational depth, the supply trucks themselves consumed a massive portion of the very fuel they were carrying, creating a self-defeating logistical loop. Furthermore, the acute global rubber shortage prevented the timely replacement of worn tires, forcing many truck drivers to run on bare steel rims, which destroyed the wheel bearings and axles. Without a massive, continuous influx of fresh motorized transport, which the German war economy was physically incapable of producing, any offensive launched toward Moscow in late August would have ground to a halt within 100 kilometers due to the complete collapse of the motorized supply columns, leaving the armored divisions stranded and exposed to encirclement. The proponents of the Moscow First strategy often argued that launching the offensive in late August would have allowed the Wehrmacht to capture the capital before the autumn rains turned the Russian soil into an impassable ocean of mud. However, this argument ignores the physical, meteorological, and geological realities of the Russian Rasputitsa. The central Russian plain is covered by a highly dense organic soil structure known as Chernozem, or black earth, which possesses an extraordinary capacity to absorb water. Even a brief, moderate rainfall, which historically occurs with high frequency in late August and September, transforms this soil into a thick, sticky and cohesive clay that clings to vehicle chassis, clogs track links, and exerts an immense drag on towing hooks. During the historical Battle of Vyazma in October, German tanks and trucks were forced to burn through their entire fuel reserves just to travel a few kilometers through the mud, requiring up to 3 prime movers coupled together to pull a single light artillery piece. Had Operation Wotan been launched in late August, the offensive would have run directly into the late summer and early autumn storm fronts that routinely sweep across the Vyazma-Bryansk line. The Wehrmacht possessed virtually no specialized wide-tracked mud-going vehicles, as their panzers were designed with narrow tracks optimized for the paved road networks of Western Europe, resulting in high ground pressure that caused them to sink to their bellies in the wet Chernozem. The logistical consequences of this geological quagmire would have been catastrophic. Horse-drawn supply columns, which supported the vast majority of the infantry divisions, would have collapsed completely as thousands of horses died of physical exhaustion and colic from drinking polluted mud water. Motorized supply columns would have been abandoned along the single-track highways, creating massive multi-kilometer traffic jams that presented highly vulnerable targets for the Soviet Air Force. The physical reality of the Rasputitsa proved that the timing of the German offensive was not a flexible variable that could be managed by strategic willpower. Rather, it was a rigid environmental barrier that would have paralyzed any German offensive toward Moscow, whether it was launched in August, September, or October. While the Wehrmacht grappled with the unyielding laws of logistics and climate, they would have also faced a formidable, rapidly evolving military obstacle: the massive mobilization capacity of the Soviet Stavka and the defensive genius of General Georgy Zhukov. A central tenet of the post-war German generals' memoirs was the assumption that the Red Army had exhausted its strategic reserves by late August 1941, leaving the road to Moscow wide open. This assumption was a colossal intelligence failure that ignored the deep structural mobilization systems of the Soviet state. Historically, between July and October 1941, the Soviet Union mobilized and deployed over 200 fresh divisions, representing over 2.5 million men, many of whom were concentrated directly along the western approaches to Moscow. Under the direction of Zhukov, the Stavka constructed the massive Mojaisk defense line, a highly dense, multi-layered defensive network that stretched for over 300 kilometers from Kalinin in the north to Kaluga in the south. This line was composed of concrete bunker complexes, deep anti-tank ditches, extensive barbed wire entanglements, and highly concentrated artillery positions designed specifically to absorb and channel German armored thrusts into lethal fire zones. Had Operation Wotan been launched, Bock's Army Group Center would have slammed directly into this formidable fortress, which was manned by fresh, well-equipped and highly motivated Siberian and Far Eastern divisions that had been systematically transferred westward by General Joseph Apanasenko via the double-track Trans-Siberian Railway. These Siberian forces were uniquely trained and equipped for winter warfare, possessing excellent winter clothing, automatic weapons, and heavy KV-1 and T-34 tanks that were mechanically superior to the light Panzer IIs and IIIs that formed the bulk of the German armored strength. Rather than achieving a rapid, clean breakthrough, the Wehrmacht would have been drawn into a brutal, attritional struggle of position against a deeply dug-in enemy that possessed absolute local numerical and material superiority, transforming the approaches to Moscow into a meat grinder that would have shattered the offensive power of the Ostiya permanently. In conclusion, the counterfactual of Operation Wotan reveals that the Moscow First strategy advocated by Franz Halder and Heinz Guderian was a grand strategic illusion that ignored the fundamental physical, logistical, and material limits of the German war machine. The post-war memoirs of these generals, which sought to shift the entire responsibility for the defeat in the East onto the erratic decisions of Adolf Hitler, created a highly distorted narrative that has dominated popular military history for decades. When subjected to rigorous scholarly analysis, it becomes clear that the Wehrmacht lacked the logistical rail capacity, the motorized transport durability, the rubber and fuel reserves, and the specialized winter equipment required to sustain a continuous deep offensive toward Moscow in the late summer of 1941. Bypassing Kiev to launch a direct thrust toward the capital would not have won the war. Instead, it would have merely accelerated the Wehrmacht's logistical collapse, stranding their elite panzer groups in the mud of the Vyazma line without fuel, ammunition, or winter clothing, while exposing their overextended southern flank to a devastating counterstrike by the massive untouched Soviet southwestern front. The defeat of Germany on the Eastern Front was not decided by a single tactical detour or a missed operational opportunity, but by the unyielding economic, demographic, and industrial weight of the Soviet Union, which mobilized its vast resources to construct an insurmountable wall of steel before its capital. Operation Wotan stands not as a missed path to victory, but as a striking testament to the profound limits of operational planning when decoupled from the hard mathematical realities of global industrial war.